Hello, dear friends. This is Euda Murambiwa. Today we're on lesson 3 titled Memorials of Grace. So, on Sabbath afternoon, I encourage you to read for this week's study Joshua chapter 3, Numbers chapter 14, verse 44, and Luke chapter 18, from verse 18 to 27. Joshua chapter 4 and John chapter 14, verse 26, together with Hebrews chapter 4, from verse 8 to 11. So, these are the verses I encourage you to study as we prepare for Sabbath lesson for quarterly. So our text says, "For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." This new text is coming from Joshua chapter 4, from verse 23 and 24. A story is told of a police officer who signaled John for him to pull over. The police officer asked for his driver's license, and at that moment it dawned on John that he had left his wallet with his driver's license in the office where he worked. John explained what happened, and the officer asked about his job. John responded that he was a professor. As the officer gave John a ticket, he told him not to think of it as a fine. It's a tuition, he said. When people want to learn something, they pay tuition. This is your tuition to learn not to forget your license when driving. Have a good day, Professor. As human beings, we are prone to forget things that are not constantly in our sight. We forget to return phone calls, to respond to emails, to water the plants, to send birthday wishes, and so forth and so forth. The list could go on and go on. Forgetting about our spiritual needs, however, could have a more severe consequence than simply receiving a fine, especially because we are dealing with what is literally our eternal destiny. So, dear friends, let's study the crossing of the Jordan by the Hebrews and see what we can learn from their experiences. So, let's move on to Sunday. We have the subtopic crossing the Jordan. I encourage you to read Joshua chapter 3 from verse 1 to 5 and Numbers chapter 14 from verse 41 to 44. Why did God ask the Israelites to specially prepare for what was about to happen? So this is the question we want to discuss as we are highlighting the points in this lesson on Sunday. This is the first time the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned in the book of Joshua. Until this point in the Old Testament narrative, the Ark is appeared in the context of the sanctuary. See Exodus chapter 40 verse 21, and in Israel's journey from Sinai. See Numbers 10 from verse 33 to 36, and at the unsuccessful attempt to begin the conquest of Canaan. See Numbers chapter 14 verse 44. It was the most sacred object in Israelite sanctuary, and it is enthroned above the cherubims that were covering the Ark of the Covenant. We see this in Exodus chapter 25 verse 22, in Numbers chapter 7 verse 8 and 9, and whose movements are identified with the Ark's movements, enters Canaan in front of the Israelites as the one leading the conquest. So the term translated sanctify is given in Joshua chapter 3 verse 5, and also consecrate refers to a purification process similar to what the priests followed before beginning their service in the sanctuary. See Exodus chapter 28 verse 41, and also Exodus chapter 29 verse 1. And what the people of Israel carried out prior to God's revelation at Sinai. See Exodus chapter 19 verse 10 and verse 14. So, dear friends, this consecration involved the laying aside of sin and the removal of all ritual impurities. The same command appears in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 18, relating to an impending miracle of God. Such a preparation also was required before battles were fought in a war. So you see this in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 14, as a reference to this thought. So before God can fight for Israel in battle, they must show their allegiance to Him and trust in Him as their commander. The miracle of crossing the Jordan was going to prove to the Israelites that the Lord's promise to drive out these people in the land could be trusted. He who could secure a dry passage through the Jordan also could grant them the gift of the land. So, dear friends, God does not always part the Jordan. His interventions are not always so obvious. How do you think we can develop this spiritual preparedness to experience and discern God's intervention on our behalf? So, dear friends, I encourage you to chew upon this question and ponder upon it and discuss it. It's very pertinent and powerful. So, let's move on to Monday, of the subtopic, the living God of wonders. So, let's read Joshua chapter 3 from verse 6 to 17. This question I want to pose to you, dear friends, my listening friends. What does the miraculous crossing of the Jordan tell us about the nature of the God whom we serve? The crossing of the Jordan River is described in Joshua chapter 3, verse 5, by the Hebrew word niflaot, or miracles or wonders in English, which usually refers to the mighty supernatural acts of God that demonstrate His uniqueness. So we see this as reference in Psalms, I mean to say, the book of Psalms, chapter 17, verse 18, and chapter 86, verse 10. So later, the Israelites meditated on these acts and as a result, praised the Lord, Psalm chapter 9, verse 1, and proclaimed Him among the nations. Is impossible, Hebrew, too wonderful for Him to accomplish. See Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 17. His name and His nature are wonderful. Judges chapter 13, verse 18. And He is beyond our comprehension. In contrast with the gods of other nations who cannot save, see Psalm chapter 96, verse 5, and Isaiah chapter 44, verse 8. The God of the Bible is a living God, active and alive, whose followers can trust Him in anticipation of His interventions on their behalf. So the prophet Zechariah used the same term from the same root as Niflaot, a Hebrew word, as he envisioned a future for Israel after the Babylonian exile. He saw that Jerusalem would be fully rebuilt with all the people sitting in the streets of the city and the boys and girls playing there. To the seemingly incredulous inhabitants of the capital still displaying the signs of its destruction, Zechariah declared, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if it is marvelous in the sight of the remnant of these people in those days, should it also be marvelous in my sight, declares the Lord of hosts. Thus said the Lord of hosts, behold, I will save my people from the east country and from the west country, and I will bring them to dwell in the midst of Jerusalem." That's what Zechariah says. Chapter 8, from verse 6 to 8. So let's read the book of Luke, chapter 18, from verse 18 to 27. How does Jesus' answer to His disciples encourage you and me to trust God with what seems impossible? So we move on with our lesson. Let's move on to Tuesday. We have the subtopic, remember. So when something says remember, it means you are prone to forget. Even in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 to 11, that commandment starts with remember. So let's read Joshua chapter 4. Why did God ask the Israelites to build a memorial? So the purpose of these stones is to become a sign. So the Hebrew term is often associated with the word wonder and can refer to miraculous acts done by God. We can reference this to yesterday's lesson that we did, such as the plagues on Egypt. See Exodus 7, verse 3 and Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 34. It also can carry the meaning of symbol or token as an outward sign of a deeper or transcendent reality. For example, the rainbow is a sign of the covenant. See Genesis chapter 9, verse 12 and 13. The blood on the doorposts of the lintels of the Israelite house also is called a sign See Exodus chapter 12, verse 13. And more significantly, the Sabbath is a sign of creation and of God's sanctifying presence. See Exodus chapter 31, verse 13 and 17, and Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, and chapter 12, verse 26 to 27, and Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20 to 25, was common in the Old Testament. Instead of repeating the miracles again and again, God establishes monuments that evoke the memory of his great acts and prompt meaningful answers. Therefore, dear friends, the sign is to be there forever, implying the need to keep this miracle of the Lord in the collective memory of his people perpetually or continually. The potential question of future generations is significant because it is formulated in a personal way. What are these stones to you? A new generation must internalize and understand the meaning of these stones for themselves personally. The faith in a miracle making God can be kept alive only if a generation rediscovers the significance of the mighty acts of Yahweh for themselves. Such a faith will make a major difference between living out faithfully Bible based traditions and traditionalism, the dead religion, deprived of its original value in favor of the living generation. In the end, we need to make our Bible based faith our own. How do we get the difference? So, no one, especially our ancestors, can believe for us. We need to believe ourselves. So, difference. What are some of the memorials, personal memorials from your own walk with the Lord that help you remember what is done for you? So let's move on to Wednesday. We have the subtopic forgetfulness. So, dear friends, I will encourage you to read the book of Joshua, chapter 4, from verse 20 to 24, in the light of the following verses: Judges chapter 3, verse 7, Judges chapter 8, verse 34, Psalm chapter 78, verse 11, Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 and 18, and Psalm chapter 45, verse 17. Why was it so important to remember the mighty deeds of the Lord? Do you hear this question, dear friends? So notice the charge in person in the following books, in the following chapter of Joshua, chapter 4, verse 23. The waters of the Jordan are referred to as having been dried up before you. That is, before all the Israelites who have just crossed the Jordan. In contrast, the Red Sea is said to have been dried up before us. Those who were still present from the first generation and who experienced the Exodus. The two events experienced by two different generations were similar in significance, which enabled the second generation, through the testimony of their parents, to rediscover the same meaning of the Jordan crossing for themselves. Generally, we perceive forgetfulness as a normal trait of all human beings. However, example, with a peculiar calling and mission, we have to create occasions for refreshing both our individual and corporate spiritual memory in order to keep in focus where we are coming from, who we are, and what we are here for. So read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24 to 25, and John chapter 14, verse 26. Why must we always remember what Christ did for us? What else really matters without it? Do you hear this question difference? So I want to quote this quotation from the Inspired Pen, where the prophetess Ellen G. White clearly understood that without constantly guiding ourselves in the light of God's past acts and revelation, we will surely lose the motivation to carry out our mission in the future. She says, open quote, "We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history." Close quote. Ellen G. White, Life Sketches, page 196. Though it is important to remember the past and how the Lord has worked in your life, why must you day by day have an experience with him and the reality of his love and the presence now. Do we hear this question, dear friends? We need to have this experience with him and this reality of his love and presence today. So let's move on to Thursday, our last day. Beyond the Jordan is the subtopic. We turned the sea into dry land. They went through the river on foot. They will rejoice in him. Psalm 66, verse 6. Both the crossing of the Red Sea and of the Jordan are markers of a new era in biblical history, and both carry symbolic significance. See Psalm 66, verse 6, and Psalm 114, verse 1 to 7, and 2 Kings chapter 2, from verse 6 to 15. Already in the New Testament, there are texts that link the two crossing events and recognize a meaning which points beyond the original settings. In Psalm chapter 66, the psalmist celebrated God's redemptive act in his life. See Psalm 66 from verse 16 to 19. By referring to the historical examples of the crossing of the Red Sea and of the Jordan, Psalm 114 also ties the two events together, not because the author did not see a chronological difference between them, but because of the theological significance that the two crossings share. Thus, both events are seen as contributing to a change in Israel's status, once from slavery to freedom, then from nomadic landlessness to nationhood. In these songs, the examples of these two crossings illustrate the change in status of the author from oppression, poverty, helplessness, and humiliation to safety, well-being, salvation, and dignity. It is also by the Jordan that Elijah's translation takes place in the context of a similar miracle by the one recorded in Joshua. For Elijah, the crossing brought the most significant status change in it. How do these writers of the New Testament imply a symbolic spiritual meaning of the Jordan River? That's a question we need to digest and discuss upon, dear friends. So the earthly ministry of Jesus as the representative of Israel follows the pattern of the history of ancient Israel. Jesus undergoes the Red Sea and the Jordan experiences. He is called out of Egypt after a death decree. See Matthew chapter 2 from verse 14 to 16. Spends 40 days in the wilderness. See Matthew chapter 4 verse 2. Similar to ancient Israel's 40 years, and as a transition from his private life to his public ministry, he is baptized in the Jordan River. Matthew chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, and Mark chapter 1, verse 9. Later, Hebrews chapter 3 up to chapter 4 recognize the symbolic significance of the crossing of the Jordan and presents the entrance into Canaan as foreshadowing the rest of grace that Christians enter through faith. In conclusion, dear friends, I would like us to read the following thoughts from the inspired pen of Ellen G. White. Study carefully the experiences of Israel in their travels to Canaan. Study the 3rd and 4th chapters of Joshua, recording their preparation for and the passage over the Jordan into the promised land. We need to keep the heart and the mind in training by refreshing the memory with the lessons that the Lord taught his ancient people. Then to us, as he designed it should be to them, the teachings of his word will ever be interesting and impressive. Ellen G. White comments, the SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 2, page 994. Modern Israel are in greater danger of forgetting God and being led into idolatry than his ancient people. Many idols are worshipped, even by professed Sabbathkeepers. God especially charged his ancient people to guard against idolatry. For if they should be led away from serving the living God, his case would rest upon them. While if they would love him with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their might, he would abundantly bless them. in basket and in store, and would remove sickness from the midst of them. Ellen G. White, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 609. So as we close up our lesson, dear friends, I want us to ponder upon these discussion questions so that we discuss and liven up the lesson as we discuss these discussion questions. So, dear friends, as we look at the miraculous crossing of the Jordan, how would you define miracles? Why does it seem that God is not performing similar miracles today? So, what practical ways can you suggest in Mark chapter 1, verse 9? Later, Hebrews chapter 3, Hebrews chapter 4 recognize the symbolic significance of the crossing of the Jordan and presents the entrance into Canaan as foreshadowing the rest of grace that Christians enter through faith. In conclusion, dear friends, I would like us to read the following thoughts from the inspired pen of Ellen G. White. Study carefully the experiences of Israel in their travels to Canaan. Study the 3rd and 4th chapters of Joshua, recording their preparation for and the passage over the Jordan into the promised land. We need to keep the heart and the mind in training by refreshing the memory with the lessons that the Lord taught his ancient people. Then to us, as he designed it should be to them, the teaching of his word will ever be interesting and impressive. Ellen G. White comments, the SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 2, page 994. Modern Israel are in greater danger of forgetting God and being led into idolatry than his ancient people. Many idols are worshipped, even by professed Sabbath keepers. God especially charged his ancient people to guard against idolatry. For if they should be led away from serving the living God, his case would rest upon them. While if they would love him with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their might, he would abundantly bless them in basket and in store, and would remove sickness from the midst of them. Ellen G. White, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 609. So as we close up our lesson, dear friends, I want us to ponder upon these discussion questions so that we discuss and liven up the lesson as we discuss these discussion questions. So, dear friends, as we look at the miraculous crossing of the Jordan, how would you define miracles? Why does it seem that God is not performing similar miracles today? So, what practical ways can you suggest in your class, in your small groups, wherever you are, for preventing spiritual forgetfulness, both as individuals or as a church? While it is important that we have an ongoing dynamic relationship with God and that we don't build our whole Christian experience on powerful past experiences, how can we still use our past experiences as reminders of how God has worked in our lives? So how do you think the Sabbath can, on the one hand, help us remember God's interventions in our lives, and on the other, give us a fortress of the promised rest in his kingdom? How does the Sabbath point not only to what we are supposed to remember, but to what we can hope for in the future? Thank you so much, dear friends. May God bless you.